Oh, hi there. I wanted to cover a topic today. I'm glad you could join us. Modesty. Modesty is something that comes up as a social issue a lot of times in religion. And there's so many variations that. Fuck.
What?
You know what? I'm so sick of redoing this. Let's go with it. So. um, Really, when you're talking about modesty in all seriousness, we're talking about principle. In one of my previous videos, I keep having like go over the same thing. But in one of my previous videos, I talked about how there is principle, like morals, that illustrate more or less the will of God. So the meat and taters of religion, so to speak. And then from those higher principles, those moral principles, come law, what I call law, which are circumstantial how to's or ought and ought not, you know, the rules that everyone hates. In terms of religion, modesty has been a hot topic for thousands of years since there's been religion. And I just want to like cover it. So, the principle that underlies modesty is really about self determination. And really, when we mean modesty, let's be honest, we're talking about women in the sight of men dressing according to the standards of men's tolerance, at least in terms of religion. And that application is what I would designate as the application of the law versus the application of the principle. The law is employed that women generally, in many different faiths, must dress to cover their bodies to whichever extent, cover their hair, basically cover their sexiness in the sight of men, so as to not be a distraction or as to not lead men to sin, either with their eyes or otherwise. So it's to impose that upon women has been an exercise of that lower tier of the law. But the overall principle behind modesty actually doesn't have anything to do with dress or dress code. And I'm going to talk about this from the perspective of a man, for men for the most part, for obvious reasons. Self-determination. I talked about self-determination a little bit before. But another meaning of it is that nobody outside of yourself determines your character. So self-determination doesn't only rely on the independence of your thought or the independence of your actions. It doesn't just mean accountability, which it does, but it also applies, another way of saying it is nobody outside of yourself makes up your character, neither by who they are, how they dress, or etc. The principle is to react minimally, instead lead with action, and this is a feature of what I call discipline. Modesty, dress code, limitations on what women should wear and not in terms of in religious circles more often than not. is a way of trying to apply the very crudest form of this principle. Continuing, a woman should not have to accommodate the weakness of a man's eyes by how she appears, but should be able to rely on the strength of her male peers to see her with equal sight. It's not on the woman to keep men in check, but man to keep himself in check. That's really the optimization of the principle of self-determination. It's about self-discipline. It's about being able, it's also about detachment. Detachment itself is another topic that's really worth exploring further later, but it also has to do with detachment. So when it comes to detachment, the idea is that yourself, meaning your character, your accountability before the judge of us all, which we call the truth, is not dependent on others. It's not dependent on how they appear. And a practical application of that tends to be, how do I say, like the downfall of many men in particular, is that they see a woman under the context of maybe what she's wearing, how she appears, and they automatically lose the integrity or the ability to discern. They automatically lose the ability to treat her with the equal sight of how they treated her when she was not objectified in their minds. It is a temptation and it's a weakness of man to try to objectify women and to make them an object of adoration or worship rather than an object of autonomy and respect, as should be or ought to be incumbent on us as men of faith. And that's part of what self-determination means too. I mean, this is all I wrote on here, but it's like when you have the ability as a person in general, but in this context as a man, to see things with an equal sight, you develop a sense of justice, a sense of equality. That itself is a godly sense to have. Because if you do not develop that self-determination or that discipline, then by the whims of the changing world, you are determined. You react according to what's going on around you, according to things and how they appear, rather than the substance of things. And you're taken away easily down roads that are unnecessary. But a lot of times what's happened, and which is the eternally frustrating thing, is that in terms of cultural conditioning, was this Mountain Dew in the way the whole time? In terms of cultural conditioning, it becomes put on the shoulders of the women to accommodate the weakness of men, rather than men trying to find a higher strength and trying to be disciplined enough to move past their reactionary impulse. And that's really something that ought to be honed in on and modified and refined in terms of manhood, in terms of, achieving a type of self-discipline that is religion, essentially. But sadly, that process has been interrupted by the idea that women must stoop to the level of a man's carnal desire and live according to his weakness. And sadly, as much, the man is determined by how the woman appears rather than who she is. So these laws, like, I hope this is coming together in some cohesive way, because these laws are the crude forms of the principles that are above and underlie them. The principle of self-determination, we could say, is sort of the mother principle behind modesty, behind the idea of modesty. It's not so much, okay, you shouldn't tempt people. That's the law. But the principle is that you should leave yourself as little in a position to be tempted as is within your own power and awareness. I'll put it that way. That is a higher principle. Maybe it's sufficient to follow the law and just say, what are you doing? Put on your trash bag. I don't want to see. Maybe that, to me, that's an egregious thing. But that is a primitive, meaning like first elementary way of approaching that principle. But the higher way of doing it is just not regarding the presentation of modest or not regarding it as consequential to how you are as a character. And that's really the point I want to drive home with this. Thanks for watching.